150 slides to go through. And I think we'll be able to get through it in an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. Let's aim for that. So I'm talking just about the early history of Hazelhurst. Lots of old residents of Hazelhurst know and are familiar with the more recent history, so I won't be going into that at all. Hazelhurst, there is a book, Hazelhurst, a pamphlet, I should say, or a booklet that was published at the time of the Hazelhurst Centennial in 1987. And Hazelhurst assumed that it was established in 1987 without any evidence of that fact. Lakeland Times also followed Hazelhurst Centennial and did a centennial edition in 1887. The oops is that Hazelhurst wasn't established until 1889. And if you look at this book, this booklet, and it's probably hard to get, there aren't any facts, and there is no discussion about exactly when Hazelhurst was established. What happened is that they knew that the railroad was completed past Hazelhurst in 1887. Tracks were laid that far in October of 1887. And I think the assumption was that Hazelhurst just sprang up into existence at that time. And that is not what happened. So what we're dealing with at that time is, here's the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line that was extended from Merrill to Minocqua during 1887. And tracks, like I said, were laid past Hazelhurst in October. Prior to that time, though, prior to the construction of the Milwaukee Road into Minocqua, there weren't any settlements in this area. This was strictly a wild area. There were earlier settlements east and west of us. To the west, the Wisconsin Central Railroad built a line to Ashland in the 1870s. That construction took several years because they had financial difficulties during the construction, but they eventually did build all the way to Ashland, and in fact continued on to Duluth and Superior. So Fifield and Phillips existed long before Minocqua and Hazelhurst. And then to the east of us, this is a rail line. This is the Milwaukee Lake Shore and Western Rail Line that went up to Watersmeet. That was constructed in the early 1880s. They extended it from Antigo up to Monaco with a spur to Rhinelander in 1882. Rhinelander existed starting in 1882, and then they continued on to Watersmeet in 1883. Eagle River existed in 1883. It was established in 1883. So in 1887, when the railroad was built up to this area, there were towns, there were settlements east and west of us, but the only activity going on in this central area, there was logging, and it was being done along the rivers, along the Wisconsin River and along the Tomahawk River and the Squirrel River. But the logging was being done only close enough to the rivers so that they could haul sleigh loads of logs to the river landings so that the logs could be floated downstream in the spring. So it was during the winter of 1887 1886 and 87 that the railroad surveyed the line to Minocqua, and then in the spring of 87 they started construction of the line. And that's what the talk in July is going to be about, the construction of the railroad up to Minocqua. I have a few slides to whet your interest in that construction activity. It was done by hand, largely, by horsepower, and I mean real horses, not diesel horsepower. It was done by horsepower and men. So the tracks were laid to past Hazelhurst, but there was no Hazelhurst at the time, and this was just wild here. Now, the Yawkey family had began logging out in the eastern United States, starting in the mid-1800s. And then by the 1880s, they had moved their logging activities to lower Michigan. And in 1882, well, the head of the Yawkey family was John H. Yawkey. His son, William Yawkey, started acquiring land around Hazelhurst and to the south and east and west in 1882. And he, in fact, purchased the land that the Sawmill ended up being built on in the village of Hazelhurst on the west shore of Lake Catherine. He owned a half interest in that property starting in 1882. At that time, he was buying land all over here on the assumption that they would be logging it sometime in the future. He didn't have there wasn't any specific plan at that time for construction of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul extension, but it did happen. It was a reasonable assumption on his part that there would be a railroad built up here. So in 1888, Yawkey, William Yawkey, not John, William Yawkey formed the Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company. William Yawkey was the money, and his son, or nephew rather, Cyrus, who is seated here, Cyrus Yawkey was William's nephew, and a business partner, George Lee, were the general partners of the Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company, and William Yawkey was the special partner who provided funds for it. Now this is a picture taken in 1889, I'm sure, when the Yawkey and Lee Company began building the town or village of Hazelhurst and building the sawmill. The timing well, let me back up. There are I've heard a lot of references or read in various places, references to the Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company beginning their logging up in this area, in the Hazelhurst area, in the winter of 1888 and 89. Now, in my research, in my history research, one of the sources that I looked at was the newspapers that were published in Wausau, Merrill, and Rhinelander before this area was settled. So starting in about 1885, started looking at those looked at those newspapers starting in 1885 for information about what was happening up here. And the Merrill and Wausau papers in particular paid a lot of attention because they were in the Wisconsin River Valley. They paid a lot of attention to activities north of them in the Wisconsin River Valley and the Tomahawk River. And in the winter of 1888-89, they reported who was logging up here. There was extensive notes in the paper about what company or what logger was logging where their camps were, how much they were cutting at each camp. There is not a single reference in any of those papers, and those papers are the Wausau Pilot Review, and that's in, of course, Wausau, the Northwoods News in Rhinelander, the Lincoln County Advocate in Merrill, the Northern Wisconsin News in Merrill, Rhinelander Vindicator, and Rhinelander New North. There was never a mention of the Yawkey Company doing any logging up here in 1888-89. So I don't know where that notion came from. The article that announced, in the paper that announced this talk tonight, in fact, referred to the Yawkey Company logging up here in 1888-89. So I have yet to find any contemporaneous documentation of the fact that they actually did that. The first mention of Hazelhurst in those newspapers south of us occurred on May 21, 1889. When in the Wausau Pilot Review, it reported that Ori Lamphere and Dave Parcher were down from Hazelhurst for several days last week. They are at work on the Yawkey and Lee Sawmill. and report that the same will be ready to run by July 1. The work of raising began yesterday. And then in September 17, WASA pilot review. They reported that Dave Parcher has finished his work on the mill of Yawkey and Lee at Hazelhurst and returned to Wassa on Friday evening. Then in October 15 of 1889, Yawkey and Lee of Hazelhurst have shipped 7 carloads of lumber from their mill. They are sawing out on an average of 40,000 board feet, they're referring to, a day, and have their shingle mill in full operation. So there was pretty good documentation that Hazelhurst was established in the summer of 1889. Now, it is possible, I wonder, because they're talking about the sawmill sawing lumber already in the fall of '89, and they didn't usually log up here in the summer. They did their logging in the winter when it was easier to transport logs on logging sleighs on ice roads. So that suggests to me that perhaps there was some logging done by Yawkey and Lee in the winter before, because they knew they were going to be building a sawmill here, and they wanted to have a supply of lumber ready to go into the sawmill. So, you know, that certainly is a suggestion that there was some logging here. They certainly would have had to log off the Hazelhurst town site. There probably was a lot of pine there. And they may have gone out farther than that. But it would have been difficult because they didn't have any of the infrastructure built. I mean, there was nothing built in the town. The railroads weren't built. The railroad lines that the logging lines that they built out into the woods to transport, those had to be located with respect to the exact location of the sawmill, and they didn't have any of that. So I don't know. It is puzzling whether there was logging ahead of time, but they were sawing already in the fall of 1889. Now here is a 1937 aerial photo. This is November of 1937. This aerial photo of Hazelhurst, on which I've superimposed the logging, the Yawkey and Lee logging, or rather sawmill information. The sawmill is located here. Now to orient yourself, of course we have the new highway, the current Highway 51, which was just being built at the time of this aerial photo, and we'll be talking about that later. Right here is the boat landing. If you're familiar with where the boat landing is in Hazelhurst, and the public beach is right here. The sawmill was immediately north of where the boat landing is, or boat launch is now. And to the south of that was the boarding house, and the shingle mill and planing mill. And here's a Google Earth photo of that same area. So here's the current town office, the community building. The sawmill was located directly east of that, right in this area. The area where you'll see in the photos that I'll be showing, the area where the town offices are, and this whole area here, was covered by elevated tramways. So here's a view down the shoreline looking north along the west shore of Lake Catherine. The sawmill here, and the boarding house, the company store and offices back there. It's hard to see. There's some smoke coming out, or steam coming out of the sawmill, and the Yawkey cottage here. So today's boat landing would be right in this area here, and this would be where the public park is and beach. This is a very early photo of the boarding house before any additions were built. This is probably no later than 1892. It is clear that Yawkey had a professional photographer come up, probably in 1890 and again in 1892 and maybe 1895, because these pictures predate the era of photo postcards. Those started in the very earliest ones started in 1905. In this area, most photo postcards don't predate 1907. So this is a very early photo, either 1890, maybe 1892. shows how the boarding house originally looked. And this is a Lima Shea geared locomotive hauling logs. This would have hauled it from out in the woods where they were cutting, and it's going to dump them down this log rollway into the lake. There's a larger view here. This is a much later view because the boarding house has now does have a couple additions. Has an addition off the north side here, a big wing along the south side. There's this addition in the middle extending westward that you can't see in this photo. So this shows the sawmill. Up here you can see the elevated tramway, which we're going to see more pictures of, but this tramway extends to the west of the sawmill. And here is a view down the railroad tracks where the trains would be pulled in with logs, and the tracks are tilted so it's easier to dump the logs down these log rollways into the lake, into the hot pond. This is a recent view of that same spot. This is the public beach at Hazelhurst, the beach area, picnic area up here, and boat launch back there in front of that rock wall. This is the slope that they were rolling logs down into the lake. This area where the trees are is where the sawmill was, and then behind this concrete wall and between the concrete wall and the rocks is the boat launch. Now this turns around and looks south in that same area. This is where the railroad tracks ran to the sawmill. That bench that was carved into this had been a slope all the way down naturally, but the Yawkey company carved this out to make a flat bench to run two sets of railroad tracks on it. That park, incidentally, the boat launch at first, which was just a road access to the lake, but then this park area that was donated to the town by the Yawkey family. That came to the town in about 1930, this park area.
Yeah?
Yes?
Why are they dumping the wood into the lake? It can't go anywhere from the lake.
Well, I'll explain that shortly. We'll look at the hot pond and logs floating in it. This picture is a little later. It shows the saloon. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that Yawkey didn't allow liquor sales in Hazelhurst, and at first he didn't, and I'll be telling the story about that a little later. But it wasn't probably by the mid-1890s, he decided that it was better to have a saloon that he could control rather than having his men walk to Minocqua or walk to Lake Tomahawk to drink. This is a photo from the boarding house looking north at the sawmill. Look at all the firewood here. That they had a boiler in the sawmill that produced electricity, produced hot water, produced steam, and it powered the machinery in the sawmill. This is the north side. So we're looking, now we've shifted over to the shoreline where the Yawkey cottage is, the Yawkey home. And it really was their home. They lived there until the late 1890s, lived there year round. But this looks at the north side of the sawmill. And the extensive tramway that was built, that's a huge building project. I mean, this is tall. This is probably 20 feet tall. And so they made this tramway here, and this one is built up really high, but that same tramway extends way back. So they use the tramways to move lumber around. You'll see that in photos too. This picture is taken from in front of the company store and company offices, looking south or south-southwest, again at the north side of the sawmill. Here we're looking from the west side of the sawmill towards the lake. And again, here's that tramway coming out the west side. The whole area was covered to make the transport of all the lumber easy. The lumber was moved around on these two-wheeled carts, and the carts acted like a fifth-wheel trailer. So they would use a horse, the cart connected to the horse. This was like the back of a semi-truck. And so it had a swivel and a hook, and they would connect the front of this load to that hook, and then this guy would drive the horse wherever they needed to go. So that's how they transported. That's why all these, you see all these tilted. It's because they're all sitting on these two-wheel carts and they're ready to be transported like this. This is inside the sawmill. There are very few pictures taken inside sawmills up here. This is in the Hazelhurst sawmill. It shows the log carriage, but it's a little confusing. They used a bandsaw. They would use a circular saw to saw a log to whatever length they wanted. But then they would use a bandsaw to saw the lumber out of that log. And it seems like the bandsaw ought to be in view in this photo, but I don't see any bandsaw, and I don't know where they moved this log, because they've already got cuts on it. I don't know where it was being cut in this photo, and maybe it's out, the bandsaw is outside of the photo. Here is the type of bandsaw that they used to saw their lumber, saw those logs into lumber. This guy is sharpening the saw. And then back here they have the circular saws, which were used to cut logs to whatever length they wanted. Okay, so here, this is a view of the hot pond. There is a guy, he's really hard to see. He's right here. And he is positioning logs to get hooked and carried up the conveyor into the sawmill. Now, why were these logs put in the water? And every sawmill up here was built on water. Big, Star Lake sawmill is built on Star Lake, and Arborvitae is built on Big Arborvitae. And there were a couple reasons. First of all, dumping the logs into the water kept them moist and kept them from drying out before they were cut. Drying out and cracking. They didn't want the log to start developing big cracks that would ruin the lumber that they wanted to saw out of it. So it needed to keep them moist. And you would see that even in today, where you see logs piled at Pukal lumber along Highway 70 East, they sprinkle water on them. Because, obviously they're not on a lake anymore. Or they never were on a lake. But that sawmill isn't on a lake, but they do keep those logs wet by spraying water on them for the same reason they were put in a lake. The other reason why they're in the lake is back then we didn't have the heavy machinery that Pukal could use to move those logs around and move them into their sawmill. And back then it was manpower that did that. And so it was much easier to move logs around and get them up into the sawmill if they were floating. So this is a view looking north towards the mill. Now this shows the extent of the hot pond. They built a wall around here, and in the winter, of course, they wanted winter was a time to keep sawing logs, and they needed to be able to move these logs up to the conveyor and up the conveyor to the sawmill. So they would pack this outer area probably was only partially heated. This inner area was heated quite warm and would never freeze even in the coldest weather, and they could continue to move logs. Now, this isn't winter, and they don't have this pack full of logs. In the winter, they'd make sure that all logs that they could fit in here were moved into the hot pond.
So how do they heat them?
From that boiler in the sawmill that would create hot water and probably steam too. They may have had steam pipes in here, but they may have just been circulating water, pulling it out of the lake, running it through the boiler and heating it and dumping it back in. the lake, and that would keep this temperature up above freezing so that it wouldn't ice up and they could keep moving the logs around. So this is taken from in front of the company store and office, looking southeast across Lake Catherine. Lots of logs out there inside the boom. So back here, we haven't looked at the planing mill and the shingle mill. There also was a box factory. So back behind the sawmill, of course, we had the extensive, in this area, extensive tramways. This area was used, from pictures it appears, was used for drying the lumber, because the lumber would come out of the sawmill. They would then stack it to be dried, and I don't know how long they dried it. I'm sure it was probably at least 6 months, maybe a year. And then when it was dried, they moved it into the planing mill and did the planing. So this is a photo looking west. So the sawmill is behind the photographer, and we're looking west. This is the planing mill. Over here is the shingle mill. Wood shingles were a big product back then. They didn't have asphalt shingles, and roofs were shingled with wood shingles. So the shingle mill was here. The railroad, let me back up. There was a spur of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, where cars, where cars could come up, and you can see the remnant of the railroad tracks here. They came up between the planing mill and the shingle mill. So the planed lumber came out of this side of the planing mill and was loaded right in boxcars. And there the boxcars are. So we'll see a picture, maybe it's the next one, of the north side of this planing mill, where, yeah, there it is, where there's all this dried lumber ready to go into the planing mill, and then it would come out and be loaded in boxcars. So this, again, if you can picture where this is. This is the road that you would take to Jacoby's, and the planing mill was about there, shingle mill there. These are estimated locations. We did not have the benefit of any kind of survey of the village of Hazelhurst during the Yawkey sawmill days. We came up with this partly by deduction and partly by the knowledge of Rob Hagee, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but he helped me deduce where these had to be. We were not able to determine where the box factory was. The box factory was in this area somewhere, and it was said in one source that of the production out of this sawmill, half left in boxcars as planed lumber, and the other half went out as shingles and wooden boxes. So the box factory and the shingle mill were important parts of this operation. Again, we're now up here at this point. We've got the planing mill behind us and probably off the left shoulder, off to the left. And then behind us and off to the right a little bit would be the shingle mill. Now this may be the box factory. I can't tell where it was from this picture, but this looks like it might have been the box factory. And then you can see faintly here in the background, lumber stack. That's the drying lumber. So that's, again, we're looking east, we're looking towards the lake, towards the north side, the area north of the sawmill. Looking at about where certainly part of this was is where the baseball field is now. That was all covered with lumber. And here the stacks of lumber are. And again, tramways there. These tramways are a lower level. They're not built so high off the ground, but they enable it makes it, of course, very easy or much easier to move this wood around. Now, we've seen pictures of the boarding house here. That was for the single men. The company had company houses all along Yawkey Drive and partway down what's now Lakeview Avenue. Lakeview Avenue would have come only to about here because there was the sawmill and the high tramway here, and then here they were stacking the drying lumber, and then they went from those stacks into the planing mill. This is a view from out on the lake, shows the entire shoreline, starting with the boarding house down on the south end and the sawmill. This is quite a big area here. I can see stacked lumber here, the drying lumber. The planing mill smokestack is back there. And then the roof of the Yawkey home. You can't see in this view the Yawkey office and stores behind those trees. This is, I was going to move the location of this photo into a later year part of this presentation, because I think this photo was taken long after the sawmill closed down. And when the sawmill closed down, Yawkey sold the boarding house to Charles Rummery and his wife. And they ran a hotel here, and it was called the Hazelhurst House. And that's why, this postcard says Hazelhurst House, not boarding house. And that's why I think this is much later after the sawmill was closed down. This is being operated as that's a huge hotel. I don't know how they operated that. They must have used only part of it. And then behind this, the photographer in this picture, there were a couple cottages. They had 2 or 3 cottages along the lake. So they ran the Rummery Resort. You could stay in the hotel or in the cottages. So this shows this is the company offices here, and then this 2-story building is the store and the living quarters for the storekeeper, and the Cyrus Yawkey home, the William Yawkey home. So here's a closer view of the store. This picture was taken in 1892, I would say, on one of the occasions when Yawkey had a professional photographer come up to document things up here. Look at the huge flag. This is a flagpole. And I mean, if that flagpole isn't sunk 8 feet in the ground, I think it's going to be blown over in a wind, because certainly these braces aren't going to hold it up. And here I'm zoomed in on that picture. This is Cyrus Yawkey, his daughter Lee Yawkey, who became Lee Yawkey Woodson, and that's her St. Bernard. St. Bernard was named Rex. And she looks to be, she was born in 1888. She looks like she's 3 or 4 years old. So, and I don't know the exact date of her birth. I'll bet she was born late in 1888. This photo was probably taken in 1892 when she was between 3 and 4 years old. And in here, you'll see that sign that we saw in their temporary office, the Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company sign. So that too tells us that this couldn't have been taken any later than 1893, but really the age of Lee Yawkey here clinches the estimation. The Yawkey and Lee Lumber Company owned the operation in Hazelhurst only until 1893. Then it was dissolved, and the Yawkey Lumber Company was formed. George Lee was not part of the Yawkey Lumber Company. I've never read a description of what happened with George Lee, if there was a falling out or he wanted out of the business. He was no longer involved after 1893. It was the Yawkey Lumber Company then. That was just William Yawkey and Cyrus Yawkey. And then the Yawkey Lumber Company owned the operation until 1905, when Yawkeys partnered up with W.H. Bissell. And Bissell was one of the partners in the Arborvita sawmill. And Bissell, in fact, had a residence in Arborvita. And so they partnered with Bissell starting in 1905 and formed the Yawkey Bissell Lumber Company at that time. And so after beginning in 1905, the Hazelhurst operation was owned by the Yawkey Bissell Lumber Company. This picture is later. It shows an addition. It shows that the big flagpole here must have tipped over because it's gone. But they have a smaller one here. They still have a flagpole.
I think they were trees.
Yeah.
That one's got the red show.
Well, I think it's still braced. I think it's braces because it's not in. There isn't a tree there in the pictures from the side. It's not a tree. In fact, you can see the shadow of that flagpole on the building here. The sun was coming from the southeast. This is a photo taken. This could be after the sawmill closed. I'm guessing this is Tom Berg from the Berg Brothers, who started the gas station and auto livery after the sawmill closed. And I'll point that out in one of the aerial photos that are placed. So he was into boating. He had a motorboat. He probably took these people out in his boat for fishing. So here's that flagpole that was in the second picture. That's the Yawkey family: Cyrus, his wife Alice, and Lee. Probably, a composite photo in early 1890s. That's Cyrus Yawkey. This picture kind of reminds me of the famous portrait of George Washington, the father of our country. This is the portrait of the father of Hazelhurst. There's his home. He was a rich guy, of course. These days, this would be just a starter cottage up here. But back then, it was a nice home. And that's Lee Yawkey. This photo came from the Yawkey family, and it was dated August 1901. So she's 13 years old here, out in the boat with her friends. She no longer lived. The Yawkeys didn't live up here anymore at that time. In the late 1890s, I believe it was around 1898, when she was about 10 years old, they moved to Wausau for her schooling. They wanted her to get better schooling down there. And so they lived in Wausau most of the year and just spent summers up here at the cottage. So I referred to the fact that there was a prohibition of liquor sales in Hazelhurst initially. Let's see. I probably have skipped a lot of things because I'm just looking at pictures here and talking, not looking at any notes. Let me catch up here. So Hazelhurst was a company town. Yawkey owned the whole town. And initially, when the village of Hazelhurst was settled, was created, it was in the town of Pelican. Now, in 1889, there was no Vilas County. It was all Oneida County. So everything that's currently Vilas County was included in Oneida County. And there were only two townships. There was the town of Pelican and the town of Eagle River. It may have been called Lincoln at that time, and still is now. But it was the town of Eagle River. So when Yawkey created the town here, he didn't like being taxed by the town of Pelican, by the town board of Pelican. And so he had the political influence to get a Hazelhurst set off as its own township. And he was the first town chairman, and he also was the first postmaster. So he was in control of the town. And Minocqua did something similar. Minocqua didn't have the political pull Yawkey probably did, but Minocqua, when it was settled before Hazelhurst, but Minocqua celebrated its centennial in a long year. They celebrated it late. Unlike Hazelhurst, Hazelhurst celebrated theirs early. Minocqua celebrated theirs late, because the town of Minocqua, the village, was settled first settled in early 1888. You could even argue 1887, because the railroad was completed to Minocqua in December of 87, and everything started moving into town. But probably 88 is the better year to use, because the island in Minocqua wasn't logged off yet. In January of 88, that winter was when it was being logged off. And then the town was platted, and the town plat was filed in May of 88. So that certainly was the beginning of Minocqua. And when Minocqua was first created, it was similar to Hazelhurst. It was part of the town of Eagle River. And so they were able to get themselves set off as the town of Minocqua, and that happened in 1889. So the town of Minocqua was set off as its own town actually before Hazelhurst was even settled. But Minocqua celebrated its centennial based on an 1889 start, because that's when the legal township was created, but actually the town was settled over a year earlier than that. So anyway, with Yawkey in control of the town of Hazelhurst, he was able to determine that there would be no liquor sales, no liquor licenses would be issued. And he did, because he didn't want his men drinking. But of course, men will be men, and they wanted to go out to drink, and so they would walk to Minocqua, or they would walk all the way to Lake Tomahawk. And then there's an apocryphal story about a barge on Lake Catherine. Many of you have probably heard of that. So there is this story without any contemporaneous documentation from back then. But there's a story that Frank Bryant built a barge. Now, it probably wasn't a huge barge. He probably only had to make a barge big enough for maybe a 12 by 12 room, and put it out on the lake. No, why did he put it out on the lake? One of the reasons, again, there's various written stories about this. One of the reasons is that he thought he was outside of Hazelhurst, that he's in the town of Minocqua. Well, that was wrong. This is the town line right here. So none of Lake Catherine is in the town of Minocqua. It's all in Hazelhurst. So he wasn't outside the legal jurisdiction of Hazelhurst. And they really, if he wanted to have a saloon in the town of Minocqua, why didn't he just build it right here? And people, could walk 3/4 of a mile. They didn't have to take a rowboat out to a barge. So none of that makes any sense. And then the story, there are two versions of the story. One is that mysteriously the barge blew up one night and sank. Well, which seemed plausible, because Yawkey wouldn't have wanted liquor sales there. But the problem with that story is that many people have searched that bay for any evidence of a barge, and there is no evidence of it. Rob Hagee was a diver. He searched and searched that area and didn't find any evidence of any barge having sunk there. So there are problems with that story. The other version of it is that Yawkey bought out Frank Bryant, told him he would build him a saloon south of the boarding house. He could run that saloon, and then Yawkey did something with the barge. One version of the story is he sank it. But again, nobody's ever found it. So,
Dan, before you go past this map, do you know the vintage of that map that you're describing?
This is a 1938 topographic.
What are the dotted lines?
Well, the double dotted lines are roads,
Okay.
and would be not very well traveled roads. The single lines, they're depicting like a fire lane type road, something that's barely developed. So that in the early 1890s, somehow, I mean, whether it was because Frank Bryant had a barge out in the lake or had anything to do with that, Yawkey realized his men were wasting a lot of time and energy walking to Minocqua, walking to Lake Tomahawk and drinking, where he had no control over their drinking and whether they'd make it back to work. So he did come to the conclusion it was better for him to build a saloon where he controlled the saloon, he controlled its hours, he hired the bartender, or the owner of the saloon, and the owner of the saloon placed controls over how much guys could drink, and they only had to travel from the boarding house to here. So that worked out much better for Yawkey. Hazelhurst Canal, you're probably all familiar with that. That too, that's funny that I found no contemporaneous recording of the construction of that canal. It certainly was by mid-1890s it was built, and built for two reasons. One, and here it was built from this right here at the end of the northeast end of Lake Catherine to Lake Tomahawk here. And it was pretty easy to dig that in. And the stated purpose was initially so they could float logs up from Lake Tomahawk, because there's still, at that time, there was a lot of logging going on around Lake Tomahawk, and they'd be able to float logs from Lake Tomahawk into Lake Catherine. And that may in fact have been part of the plan, although it certainly would have been hard, because the canal, as most of you have probably seen, is narrow. You're not going to be floating a boom full of logs. You're going to have to float them in single file. Connect them log to log, end to end, and bring them through the canal, which would be doable, but inefficient. So I don't know how good a plan that was. Certainly the other plan, though, was to get boating access to Lake Tomahawk, pleasure boating. So it turned out, though, and this dock is near the Lake Tomahawk end, it turned out when they started the canal at Lake Catherine and dug to Lake Tomahawk, they discovered that Lake Catherine, the water level of Lake Catherine is about 3 feet higher than Lake Tomahawk. And so they did not, of course, dig all the way through, because they didn't want 3 feet of water flowing out of Lake Catherine into Lake Tomahawk. That would have made an interesting river here, because if there 3 feet of water flowing from Lake Catherine into Lake Tomahawk, we would have a river here. It would have eroded that into much more of a cut than we currently have. So they changed their mind. This is just going to be for boating. And here's Cyrus Yawkey and Aunt Alice Yawkey in their boating clothes.
Yeah.
They are going. They have a boat called Julietta, a motor launch, and they are going to Lake Tomahawk in this picture. And this guy is Fred White, the manager of the Hazelhurst operation. He managed it for the Yawkey Lumber Company. See how the women dress to go boating. And it explains why, in their very early years, there were a lot of drownings. Because of two things. First of all, these women were dressed like this to go out boating. And for the most part, they didn't know how to swim. And there were no life preservers. There was no flotation devices. So if a boat capsized or tipped over, people were drowning.
So what year is that?
This picture is probably about 1900. And it's, again, the Yawkey boat, Julietta, and it's on top the carriage to go over the ramp. And here is how the ramp, the carriage was operated with a windlass. This is a later picture in the 30s. Didn't involve the Yawkeys. This is Bert Bassett. This is Enos Fisher, who owned the Lakeland Times, or at this time it was probably the Minocqua Times. And I believe this is Enos's wife, who he married in the 1930s. I don't know who that guy is. And so it would probably take several people, like they're showing here, to pull the boat up on the cradle, and then it went down the other side. there's the cradle that the boat would sit on. Again, this is later, this could be late 30s. So we had a train depot in Hazelhurst. This is out on, again, if you take the road out to Jacoby's, here's where Jacoby's is. Train depot is right there. Right in what is now a parking area along the Bearskin Trail. So the road configuration now is the same as it was in this 1937 aerial photo. And that's what the train depot looked like. This is from the west, looking to the northeast from the southwest. So the photographer standing on the road that crossed the railroad tracks, and you'd either turn left onto Cedar Falls Road or go straight ahead onto Lower Cabashine Road. There's a train coming from the north, coming from Minocqua. And here's, again, that's just the way the road is currently configured. And this is where the parking area is along Bearskin. Hit that. Let's see what we got there. No. This is a later photo because you can see the sign here says Yawkey Bissell. So it's after 1905. A lot of passengers getting on the train there. This is a neat picture of the station agent. A smiley guy. And this is interesting, an explanation of why we have Church Road. There was a church there. There's a little closer view of it. And there it is. That's the Hazelhurst Church. It was built in 1898. The Methodist congregation in Minocqua was quite active then, and their minister would travel to Hazelhurst, Arborvita, and Star Lake and hold services. And there was enough interest in Hazelhurst in the 1890s to build a church here. So this was built in 1898. It was torn down in 1924. My guess is it sat, I should say, right where the Hazelhurst Social is now, the bar. If not right on the same site, then very close to it. The Hazelhurst Church Social, I think it's called. So this is what happened with the depot. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul stopped their passenger service to Minocqua in 1958. They had been trying for several years at that point to get permission from Interstate Commerce Commission to discontinue passenger service because there weren't many passengers. They finally got permission in 58, discontinued passenger service then, and certainly by that time then the Hazelhurst Depot would no longer have been manned. There wouldn't have been an agent there, and probably not too long after 58, it was sold. And it was sold and moved. This isn't where it sat along the railroad tracks. It was moved into town. Just to the right here, off this photo, is the former Hazelhurst Town Hall. So it sat on the road directly east of the Hazelhurst Town Hall. This picture was taken in 2015. Obviously, it already was in pretty bad shape at that time, and it was torn down a year or two later after this photo was taken. I think I heard that somebody was going to the owner was going to tear it down, and that's why I went and took pictures of it. There was a gunfight at the Hazelhurst train depot. Now, if you were here last year for the Minocqua history talk, I talked much more about the Minocqua bank robbery. That gunfight at the Hazelhurst depot is connected to that. I'm not going to describe much about the bank robbery other than that there were 3 men involved in the middle of the night, October 20, 1909, and they blew up the safe at the Bank of Minocqua, and they were armed. They had 2 guys outside making sure nobody came out on the street, and and then they left in the dark and walked down the railroad tracks. Gus Nolan at the Northern Resort, Northern Hotel, heard the explosions. They set off several explosions, dynamite charges to try to open the safe before they were successful. And he called the operator, the telephone operator in town, to tell her that he heard these guys walk by his resort on the railroad tracks. So these four men, Cap Ray, James Marvin, who was a deputy sheriff from Oneida County, and Joseph Lochran was the town marshal, John Schilling was the bank cashier. They went, they got probably a couple horses and a wagon from a livery in town and rode down to Hazelhurst to intercept the robbers. So they positioned themselves here behind, well, it's a raised platform, so they were had a little cover from the raised platform, and they waited here in the dark for the robbers, and sure enough, the robbers came down the tracks. Now, they didn't have a very good plan, I mean, because all four of them were here. They could have had them surrounded. I mean, they could have had two guys stationed up here and two down here, and waited till the guys got close, but they didn't do that. And they told them to halt, and the robbers opened fire. And it turned out that the robbers, two of them, had semi-automatic pistols. And so they were firing pretty fast at these guys. I think the locals got a couple shots off, but then were hiding. and so the three robbers got away, and they never were caught. I don't think they got huge sums of money from the bank, but they never were caught. Now, the Yawkey Lumber Company had, of course, relied on trains to transport its logs to the sawmill. They weren't coming by way of any river. All the train traffic in and out of Hazelhurst came from the south, and all of it crossed the lake that's crossing, where the Highway 51 crossing is, across Lake Catherine. So this is that crossing, shows the railroad tracks and the wagon road. Now this is a little later picture of the railroad bridge. After this photo, we'll see an early picture of it when it was supported by log cribs. This is done pretty well as a trestle. And this was probably done after a couple of years. They did this, had the time to put the effort into building a proper bridge here. Initially, there would not have been a wagon road here. When Hazelhurst was established, of course, there weren't any roads to it in any direction, and this wagon road wouldn't have been there. There was no road south of Minocqua to Hazelhurst initially. When Minocqua was settled, there was nothing south of Minocqua, not until you got to Tomahawk. And if you wanted to travel to Tomahawk, you were getting on a train. So there was initially no anticipation of the road. That's why we didn't have any bridge. We didn't initially. Initially, they had just a ferry going across the lake at the south end of the island. But again, that's part of the Minocqua history talk. But after Hazelhurst was established, then in 1890, the county established a county road between Hazelhurst and Minocqua. And still that road at Minocqua, at the lake shore of Lake Minocqua, it crossed the lake on a ferry. There wasn't a bridge there until the winter of 1892-93. So this bridge was probably not built until Hazelhurst was in existence for a couple of years. Here's the early bridge at that same location. See, it's built on cribs, log cribs. And it's just a Lima Shea geared locomotive bringing a load of logs into the sawmill. And you can see it does not look like on this photo there's any wagon bridge behind this railroad bridge. Yawkey established an actual railroad. He didn't have just a logging railroad. He established the Hazelhurst and Southeastern Railroad. And his rail lines were standard gauge. He didn't use narrow gauge here. He had standard gauge railroads, and he established his own his own railroad, Hazelhurst and Southeastern, because then he qualified to move his cars he had better rates for his moving his lumber to the south, better rates from the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad, and he built this line over to McNaughton, so he had access to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad too. And he could then make those two railroads compete with each other in quoting transportation rates to him. So he had special treatment because he was an actual railroad, not just a customer. So the railroad out of Hazelhurst came across like this red dotted line, and then continued here to I think that was called Whiteside Crossing here. And where it split, this line went to Lake Tomahawk, and this one continued down to McNaughton. And the main destination was McNaughton. This line didn't tie into the Chicago and Northwestern at Lake Tomahawk. It went there, but there was a turntable to turn the locomotive around. This one tied into the Chicago and Northwestern down at McNaughton, where the highway curves. So when you're headed south towards McNaughton, it's that first sweeping curve to the left where the Fawn Lake Road comes in. Right in that area, this railroad tied into the Chicago and Northwestern. And in fact, after this railroad was abandoned when the sawmill closed, and the tracks and ties were pulled up, this Fawn Lake Road is built entirely on the right-of-way of that former railroad, Hazelhurst to McNaughton. And you can tell that when you drive on Fawn Lake Road, there are a lot of areas you'll see where the road is cut through inclines. There's banks on both sides. And they would not have bothered to do that if it had been built as just a town road. They would have just gone over the hills. But that was built as a railroad, so they cut through and leveled it out. And you can notice that when you drive down Fawn Lake Road, that exists. This Hazelhurst and Southeastern Railroad had one locomotive. This is it. Unfortunately, a blurry picture of it. There was another railroad that is kind of interesting, because this one went to the southwest southeast and east. There was another railroad that Yawkey had. It wasn't part of his Hazelhurst and Southeastern line, but it was standard gauge. And it went to the southwest, again, for logging purposes. So there would be branch lines coming off of that all over the place, going into areas that they're logging, and they could then bring logs back into the sawmill. This one is strange, though, and Rob Hagee and I had several discussions about this, and we went and looked at this. It crosses the Chicago and the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line, the Bearskin Trail now. And the Bearskin Trail, or the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line, is built very high here. It's if you are on that and look at this bay of Lake Catherine, you're way up above it. And it is high enough for this line of the Yawkey Railroad to go underneath the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul. I've never seen anything that confirms that there was a bridge there. Never saw a picture of it, but there obviously were tracks here. You can see the right-of-way here. It goes all the way through. There's a fill here on this west shore of Lee Lake that is obviously a railroad line, and it comes here. When you drive along 51, you can see the cut here and there, and especially over down here, just north of County Y, you can see the cut for the railroad here and there. So it did go that way. It went past Garth Lake. But it's really strange, you'd have to go underneath the Chicago, Yawkey, and St. Paul there. And there aren't any